Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Taryn Jones, and I'm on the developer and community marketing team here at Kong. I'd like to welcome you all today to today's online meetup. We're going to be talking about the upcoming Kong Kubernetes Ingress Controller 2.0 release. And Shane is our senior software engineer on the Kubernetes team, and he's going to be walking you through the features that are coming up in this latest release. Shane is open to questions throughout the presentation. We just ask that you type them in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and I can try and interject and we can get that question answered. But we will also open it up for Q&A at the discussion at the very end. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Shane to kick us off. Thank you, Shane.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I prefer if people just talk, rather like put your hand up, but talk rather than the chat, because I'm gonna have a little bit of trouble keeping track of the chat while I'm doing this. Feel free to talk up. All right, so welcome. We're going to talk about the Ingress Controller 2.0. Many of you are running on 1.0. Some of you might be running on like 0.0 versions. And we're going to talk about all of the concepts around the Kubernetes Ingress Controller. We're going to review the architecture of the previous and the new architecture that's coming in 2.0, status of the 2.0 project, and the things that'll come after that. As said, I'm Shane. I'm a senior software engineer on the Kubernetes team at Kong. We're going to go over the what, why, and how of 2.0. So my hope is, I think this is the first actual presentation we've had like publicly about 2.0. It's been mostly an internal thing, or if you're a contributor in the Git repo, you probably have seen bits of it. But for anybody who's only just heard of it or hasn't heard of it yet, probably wondering what it is, why, and how. So we'll go over that. Then we'll talk about the architecture. One of the key things, or two of the key things coming up in Kick 2.0 are basically related to testing and like maintenance costs and stuff like that. So we'll talk about our use of the KubeBuilder SDK going forward with 2.0, and then our new Kong Kubernetes Testing Framework. We'll talk about a little bit, which was basically a side project that was folded up into 2.0. So the what, why, and how of Kick 2.0. So when I started the company, one of the things that we had with 1.0, we just refer to it as 1.x. So if you hear me say 1.x, that technically, for the purposes of this meeting, will refer to everything before 2.0, so like even 0.x releases. So Kick 2.0 adds a few things from the end user perspective and a few things from backend. From the end user perspective, UDP ingress support. This was a feature that came out, I believe, in upstream Kong Core 2.2 and is now going to be available in Kick 2.0. We're going to have some features around specifying single, multi, and like custom namespace watches for the controller. And we're going to have some modernizations for the code base, basically for the purposes of our contributors and for people who are on the technical side of the Kick. A fair amount of this is going to be geared at more of the technical side, just a heads up. So, but please feel free to ask questions, pretty much any questions that you have relevant to the topic. So from the backend perspective, I should probably talk about a little bit more about the modernization. An important piece of historical context is that the Kubernetes Ingress Controller was originally forked from a controller, I want to say three years ago, something like that, and uses Client Go. For those of you who aren't super familiar, Client Go is kind of the native Kubernetes API client for Golang, and it is one of the ways in which you can build a controller. I wasn't planning on talking too much about like Kubernetes fundamentals, but I will just kind of gloss over controller and say like the actual work that is done in the Kick that to translate like ingress resources ultimately to the Kong backend is done by a controller, and that is a loop that watches for updates, makes the conversions, and sends them off. We'll go over that a little bit more in the upcoming architecture slides, but just for some context to get started. So modernizing that has been kind of a factor of this KubeBuilder SDK incorporation. Used to kind of be just custom built. Now we're using an SDK to kind of generate code for us and do a lot of automatic maintenance, basically save a lot of time by using things that are maintained upstream. A re-architecture of the controller, which is partial, and we'll talk more about that. And then integration testing using our new testing framework. If you're interested, I put this link here, and you can find it. It's in Next, but it's also in Main, I think now. There is a work in progress 2.0 changelog entry where we're adding things. It's kind of we just added this, so not everything is in there yet, but you'll see things over the next couple of weeks funneling in there. If you do have questions, again, remember, just raise your hand, feel free. So why Kick 2.0? Oh, thank you for sending the link. There's some technical debt, normal part of any process, basically, any software development processes. There are points where you'll take on technical debt with the intention of paying it back later, so that you can get value up front that would otherwise have taken longer to get to. And there was some technical debt that we needed to work through here, and there were some things that we're looking forward to for the future, which we needed to kind of build some scaffolding for. So on the technical debt side of things, we had a bunch of code that we were maintaining with like client Go and stuff like that for what we will call the controller runtime. But suffice to say, all the things that you need to do to like talk to the API, pick up watches of objects, stuff like that, that was kind of done manually with client Go and a couple other libraries. That is now being replaced. Heavy maintenance for the admin API client code. We're not going to talk too much about this unless you have specific questions, but if you know the code base really in depth, you'll know that a lot of what we do is actually the work to translate things into Kong DSL from Kubernetes DSL at the lowest of levels. So there was a lot of maintenance regarding that, and we're starting to pick some of that back up and make things simpler and reducing things by re-architecting and like thinking differently about how we approach the problem. The original controller is more of a monolithic style in terms of its architecture. It makes it a little bit hard to contribute to it. I remember like my first contributions, it can be a little difficult to get in there and figure out kind of where things are. We haven't made that perfect, but with this release, it's going to be a little bit more separated. We'll have a whole slide just about that. And then testing. So I think maybe there was a lack of testing for some features, and there's some other things that are like more on the fringe of things that we wanted more testing for, but also just more, we wanted to be able to create tests faster. So that's part of why we got into like the KTF, which we'll talk about. And so for future initiatives, our next big thing that we really want to get on top of, and we already have some work started on this, but it's not very far along yet, is Gateway API. For anybody who's familiar with Services API but hasn't heard, they've changed the name to Gateway API. So if you're thinking Services API, it's the same thing. And then for anybody who's completely uninitiated, Gateway API is in many ways, you can consider it the replacement for Ingress, if you will, or the follow-up. So Ingress has been serving us pretty well. It just went into V1 not too long ago, last year, something like that in core. But Gateway is kind of the logical next step based on the learnings from that API. We also have an operator, which you may have seen. The operator is being maintained right now at a very basic level. It does some very basic things. We are working on kind of taking the operator to, I should say we aren't working on, but one of the things we want to set ourselves up for is adding a lot of features to the Kong operator. So this helps with that. High performance and scaling, we are looking at, we are specifically digging into like some of the performance characteristics of 1.x and 2.x right now, since they have significantly different code bases. And one of the things we're trying to keep ahead of is making sure that we have not only quantified performance characteristics, but between releases improved and not decreased performance characteristics. So that's something that's on our mind. And then the how. This will be a little bit more for people who want to contribute, but we kind of had this strategy going into how we were going to approach Kick 2.0. In the repository now, and I have a link right here, you'll see, I'll explain this directory structure in a minute, actually. Don't let me forget that before we get off this slide. Under the KEPs directory, we're now using the KEP process, which is, if you're not aware, it's the Kubernetes enhancement proposal process. And that now exists within Kong with the purposes of, we're not using it precisely the same as Upstream is using it. We're focusing a little bit more on using it as a consensus building tool than, we're not going too deep into the designs for things yet, because we are taking with Kick 2.0, we took a bit of a prototyping and emergent design approach. That is, we wanted to get our motivations and our goals and stuff like that figured out first. But because we wanted to be able to quickly pivot and experiment and stuff like that, we took an emergent design approach, which is we weren't super worried about what the design was up front, but rather the goals, and then allow the design to kind of work its way out of the goals as we prototype, as we actually do like kinesthetic process of building and research that way. The testing focus, which we've talked about, there's a lot more testing going on in the code base with this release, and there's test tooling that makes that a lot easier. And then code diffusion. Yeah, so this is the directory thing that I wanted to talk about. You'll see right now, we made the decision, and we may do this differently in the future, but we made the decision with 2.0 not to branch for the significant changes that we wanted to make, but instead we created a subdirectory. And the idea right now is all the new features that aren't being released are technically still in the code base for the releases under this directory. The releases you're getting are just coming from like the base root. Nothing's changed, sort of thing. The 1.3.1 that just came out the other day and so forth. But the new stuff's in here, and it's slowly coming out. We're diffusing it out into the root. We're just not there yet. So if you see that Railgun directory, just know it almost acts like a different it almost looks like a different repository, but actually links back to the root, and in time it will completely be pushed back up into the root when we finally get to beta for Kick 2.0. So right now we're only at alpha 1. The next step will be beta 1, and then obviously GA. For the alpha 1, we're going to, in beta 1, we're doing kind of like these specific milestones and releases, and for in between, we're moving to a regular release cadence. So you'll see updates to the CLI soon, or sorry, you'll see updates to the CI soon, where these releases, instead of being released by me or one of my teammates, will start being released by CI on a regular release schedule. For Kick 2.0, I think Kick 1.x is not going to change at all for how its release schedule goes. Okay, so there's links to the milestone. I think somebody put them in there for me. Thank you. Now would be a good time for questions. If anybody has them, just because we're going on to the next section. We did the what, why, and how of Kick 2.0. So if what, why, or how is not clear to you, now would be a great time to raise your hand, and I can hopefully clear that up.
Yeah, Shan. This is Jimmy. I have a question about the monolithic controller architecture. What is the main, what is the main factors that we want to, remove it and move to the new runtime controllers? Do you like to talk a little bit more about the catches and the advantages of the new architectures?
Yeah, I have. Well, I do have slides coming up specifically for that, so I will go over that topic shortly.
Oh, okay.
So if we have anything else, we can do that. Otherwise, we can go straight into that question, basically, by going to the next section. I think it's the next section. Yeah. Going once. Going twice. Okay. So one of the things we really wanted to do for 2.0, 2.x is making contributing a little bit easier. So this isn't like to say that it was super hard to contribute before, but I think it's the goal of every project to make contributing easier. This just happened to be a pretty large focus of this because at least before there were some things like if you're fairly new to Kubernetes, you're more likely to be familiar. Maybe this is a little bit of an opinion piece, but you're more likely to be familiar with like the KubeBuilder SDK or the operator SDK from Red Hat. A lot of people are coming into Kubernetes like controllers and operators from that perspective. So the older way that we used to do things like 3-4 years ago can be a little bit esoteric. And so because a lot of work over the last 3-4 years has kind of just made a lot of this available in nice succinct libraries, that's one of the big focuses of this change, rather of this release. So KubeBuilder, if you're not aware, and if you are aware of like what's the other one I just said, Red Hat's operator SDK, similar concept. It is just an SDK where you can run commands like KubeBuilder add an API, and you get an API and a controller. Previously, we used to do a lot of the, pardon me just one second. Previously, we used to do a lot of the that maintenance, basically updating things or adding new APIs, was fairly manual process. Now everything is plugged in, and you'll see at the root of the repository. Right now that's under Railgun, like we were talking about earlier, but eventually you'll see a project file, which is a YAML configuration for KubeBuilder. All of the APIs are now managed by KubeBuilder, so that if you need to make updates for them or generate configurations for them based on those updates and stuff like that, there's some automation around that can make it a lot easier. Controller runtime is Kubernetes SIGs. It's basically the way to create a controller. It's the library that makes all of that very easy. KubeBuilder generates and scaffolds out a lot of that for you. But since it's available to you, there's also some features of controller runtime we now have access to. I think in 1.x there was some stuff we may have used from controller runtime or a predecessor of, but now it's like the most modern controller runtime library is now available in the code base for developers. We have, yeah, I think I covered everything. It also manages things like our CRDs, generating RBAC rules, that kind of thing. So it's like a bunch of stuff that used to be done by hand, now just generated. If you're interested, I would definitely encourage people to go to the KubeBuilder book. I think within like 10 minutes, you can basically scaffold yourself a little Kubernetes controller and run it locally, and then start playing around with that. And that will ramp you up pretty quickly for contributing to the kick post 2.0. The Kubernetes Testing Framework. So the old integration testing framework wasn't written in Go, and that's one thing that we wanted to kind of take on directly. Among the maintainers, we wanted to switch to all of our tests being Go tests, and so that was one of the factors. And you'll see that in the KEP for the Kubernetes Testing Framework, kind of one of the motivators. We wanted more options, so the Kubernetes Testing Framework actually gets into the provisioning of, right now, just Kind clusters. If you're not familiar, Kind is Kubernetes and Docker, similar to Minikube, local Kubernetes clusters for testing and CI. We wanted options basically to say, like, very easily express, as a test, I don't want to have to do any provisioning, right? I don't want to have to think about how to build a Kubernetes cluster or anything like that. I just want it to be available to me as an object, something that I can say cluster, get the Kubernetes client for it, and start making calls to the API. So we have that now, but we also have optionality. So the testing suite that KTF gives you allows you to say, pick specific versions of Kubernetes, pick specific versions of Kong itself, so the proxy version, stuff like that. There's optionality there that wasn't available before, so that we can build a test matrix and say our CI before a release, or when we have our release CI set up, will automatically test every supported version of Kubernetes with every supported version of the proxy with this version of the kit, which is something we don't have today, but we'll have tomorrow, so to speak. So yeah, that was one of the motivating factors for the testing framework. Another one was UDP Ingress build velocity. So kind of the proof of concept for Kick 2.0, which we originally called Railgun. I probably should have mentioned that before, but Railgun was the kind of code name for it, and is based off of just an old video game joke, if you ever played the old Quake video games. So the UDP Ingress build velocity, because it was fairly hard to contribute, or rather it was harder to contribute in the old 1.x architecture and setup, UDP Ingress was like built pretty quickly. Like basically we were able to produce a preview build for it, like a prototype for it, within a couple of hours, given the KubeBuilder SDK setup and all that. And so that was part of the proof for what we were trying to do earlier on before it got okayed by product and so forth. So some highlights from that is just a lot of the code is generated now. You pretty much, if you want to, I would recommend people go take a look at what we have so far for UDP Ingress. It's under Railgun APIs. It's under our normal APIs under V1 Alpha 1. That one's getting deleted, just a heads up. But to take a look at it and just kind of pick through it before it goes to beta, you can see how most of the logic was generated, and you'll find that pretty much the only thing that we had to do was tie the pieces together for how we convert that into Kong services. Okay. Yep, and I covered that. Testing facilities. We might talk a little bit more about the KTF later, but I'm worried I'm running short on time, actually. So we'll go right into the architecture that Jameen was talking about. So let's talk a little bit about architecture. This, I hope, will be a good overview of how things are today. This is pretty high level. I mean, sort of, but this gives you an idea of more or less the workflow is the purpose of this diagram, than all of the independent details of how things work today in the kick. So you have the Kubernetes API, you have watches for resources like Ingress, Kong Ingress, native Ingress, so forth. And the event watcher picks those up, and then they get reconciled. These two blocks on the top are pretty much all given to us for free at this point by KubeBuilder, KubeBuilder SDK. During that process, we basically store a cache of these objects into a client Go based cache that is actually using upstream client Go's native in-memory KV. You could call it a KV. I don't think they specifically call that, but that's how it operates for us. And on a regular cycle, that gets converted. And depending on the configuration, whether or not it's DB-less or DB backed with Postgres, it may have an extra step of conversion through DEC. And gets sent off as a update to the Kong admin API. This is the workflow. Most of the code in the original 1.x is all kind of tightly bound, which is why we say it's monolithic in this case. It's all tightly bound and kind of integrated in one large chunk. Does anybody have any questions about this diagram? I'd hate to just skip right through this and go to the next one if people are like looking at this totally confused. We can go back too. So just, if you think of it. All right. So in Kick 2.0, we haven't completely gotten rid of some of the paradigms that we have in terms of like the workflow and like how things are built. And you'll see a lot of these items are still relatively the same. However, we have changed it intentionally so that there are more, basically, there are interfaces and more abstract layers around the different parts of that workflow. So now we have the controller component as kind of its own thing. And we have individual, we used to watch like all the resources in 1.x kind of as one big watch, or rather you could consider it that way. And now we have actual individual independent watches with their own watch rules and stuff like that for each resource that we support. Ingress, Kong Ingress, UDP. The list does go on from here. There's TCP Ingress and so forth, but that just for the purposes of this diagram. So we watch, we reconcile. For the most part, that's just validating and figuring out like this is an item that needs to be configured for in Kong. And then we pass it off to this new interface, the proxy update, or rather the update object method on the proxy interface. The proxy interface is a wraparound cache server, which still uses the client Go cache, but has a different timing mechanism basically with more tunables. There's going to be a lot more. You're going to be able to configure how this happens. So I know in previous versions, there were some tunables around like staggering updates to Kong and so forth. Some of those have been reworked, and now there are some new fields and flags about how to basically try to optimize for your environment if you have like a lot of requests coming in from the Kubernetes API. But again, this is pretty much just a cache server at this point and doesn't really understand or know anything about the last bit, which is updating Kong with these changes. So instead of having to know any of the internals or using the libraries directly, there is a function, Kong updater, and it just sends the updates over onto that at a regular interval. That remains pretty much the same, that backend, since the last architecture. So parser, dex, and config. This is the, in time, we may make significant changes to this too in a later like revisit, but at least for now, we've kept most of this intact because this is at its core kind of where most of our what's the right word? This is kind of where most of the things that we want to approach from like a technical debt perspective later still exist, but we have abstracted it a little bit so that it's a little bit more easy to reason with. And there are places in the code now where if you contribute, you won't really have to interface with these pieces depending on what you're doing. So it's not as in your face if you don't need it to be, and when you do need it to be, it's a little bit more compact, and you can jump into it. So that still works pretty much the same way from there on out. I think that's, yeah, we'll talk about some of the gains of that, but again, please do stop for questions. So we're trying to move, and 2.x isn't the end of this. We're trying to move so that everything kind of works as its own little service, microservice architecture. In the future, the intention is more or less in the future, one of the things that we're looking at potentially doing is that we would end up with not even having this last bit of configuration. And instead, when we update Kong, we would have that be individual updates with a basically with the RESTful API. We can talk more about that if people have questions, but that's kind of the high level. So we gain that kind of composability. You can jump in now, add a controller with KubeBuilder instead of having to make it yourself. The API will more or less be worked. You do have to go and hook things up in the back end a little bit, depending on what you've done. But it's there's a little bit more of a separation of concern between these components. Cleaner interfaces and stuff like that. You don't need to know what's underneath the hood unless you want to know. And there has been some, it should be easier to basically go in and take any given chunk and refactor it, given this, but also given some of the testing stuff that we've added. So that's kind of the long and short of that.
Do any of these changes have any backwards compatibility breaks?
We have, so we made it a 2.x with the intention that if we really need to, we want to be able to say, yeah, we made some backwards compatibility changes. But as it stands right now, I think we only have one very minor backwards compatibility change for the entire upgrade. We are intending for this to be a almost seamless. There is, like I said, we're working on the last little bits of that to see if that's going to be completely doable by the point we get to beta, because we're still in the alpha stage. But most of the things that we have right now that are even looking like potentially backwards incompatible have to do with features that were not in use or with flags that had to be reworked. So the answer is 99%. Yeah, everything's just going to be upgrade cleanly. Our intention is to have the Helm chart just cleanly upgrade you from 1.x to 2.x if you want that upgrade, and so forth. Did I duplicate? No, I didn't. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Shane, how do those microservices communicate with each other?
Right now,
Mm-hmm.
it's not, I guess, in the strictest of sense, it's not the technical microservice architecture where you have things talking over like gRPC and HTTP. We'd like that to be like that in the future potentially, so that we can have more separation of concern. That's a conversation for later. I'd be speculating a little bit. Right now, it's all over interface methods. Pretty much using interfaces is kind of that boundary as opposed to like actual over-the-wire APIs.
I see. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. But now would be a great time for questions in chat. Speak up. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, sorry, a quick question. So I did see that there was a slide which says you're replacing Ingress with the API gateway. I'm trying to understand what that is.
I couldn't hear that very well. I'm sorry. What slide?
Slide which said replacing Ingress with a gateway API.
Oh yeah, let's talk about that. Sure. So replacing isn't the right word. If I did say replacing earlier, I apologize. That'd be a misnomer. Gateway API will be potentially a replacement for some people to Ingress, is I think maybe what I said, but I should quantify that as we will still support Ingress, but the gateway APIs will add additional feature sets that we will also support. So we'll support both at a time. We won't be dropping support for Ingress, if that was your concern.
Got it. Yeah, that helps.
Yep, we'll have both. Any other questions? We can talk more about the future initiatives.
Hey, hi. One question. So regarding the database, right? Like, what are all the databases that you would support with the 2.0?
We're going to continue supporting just Postgres and the DB list mode in 2.0. Cassandra is currently deprecated in Kik, and it will remain that way for 2.0. We're not adding any new database support for 2.0 specifically. However, that doesn't preclude the notion that some point during the 2.0 lifetime, if there's something that people need us to support, we could add that. It's just that's not going to be coming out with 2.0 itself.
Okay, and the release for the rate limiting?
The release for the rate limiting. I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me.
Redis cache?
The update cache? Like rather the proxy update?
Sorry, the Redis, using Redis database for rate limiting.
Redis. I apologize. Yeah, no, we're not specifically adding any features around Redis for 2.0, but again, that could potentially come in a minor after 2.
So a clarification there. Hey, sorry, this is Harry. Redis for rate limiting, that's supported as it is supported on 1.x. So there is no changes to like anything, any configuration that you have on the Kong side that remains as is.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah, things will not be, this is meant to be a pretty much 99.9% backwards compatible change. For most people, there will be no difference. Like it will just roll over to the new version. Everything effectively works the same, minus a lot of these internal things have changed. Ideally, you won't notice. If you're an operator, you'll probably notice that there's different and more extensive logging, but that would be kind of the extent of it from the operator's perspective. As a contributor, you'll notice a lot of changes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Anything else? Anybody want to talk about?
I have a question, but might not be related to this. Is it okay if I can ask, like related to a multi-region or a
Yeah, go for it.
solution? So how does generally clients build for, let's say, if I have a requirement to build API gateway across 2 data centers, active modes with Postgres, as we know, like it doesn't support like active, right? So how does clients generally, or you guys suggest building that architecture?
I can take that one, Shane.
Go ahead, Harry. I saw you unmute.
Yeah. So are you running like in Kong Ingress Controller world, or are you using like Kong without the Ingress Controller and more
Ingress
like a
Controller.
traditional one?
Ingress Controller.
Yeah. So and are you using features like consumers in Kong?
Yes.
Okay. And what's your scale of consumers?
I mean, we just started the POCs, so we are getting into the stage of non-prod right now.
Okay. I mean, if you're using Kubernetes and if you're doing multiple deployments, you can do active, and the right way to do it is how you do active in multiple regions with Kubernetes, right? So here, what you would do is you would have 2 different clusters of Kubernetes in region A and region B.
Yep.
And then you would feed in the exact same configuration to these 2 clusters. When you do that, your Kong instances in these 2 regions will have the exact same configuration. And now you can do active. You cannot coordinate between those 2. Like there are some cases, like if you want to do, a terrible example is rate limiting across these 2 regions, you know, at a global level for users. You cannot do that at that point if you share. So there are some gotchas there, but that's really how you do it. If you're not using Kubernetes or if you're not using the Ingress controller, then there is something called the hybrid mode in Kong, which allows you to run Kong data planes in regions and host your control plane in one region. Right.
Okay. But in the case of where we run active workloads, like when I say active workloads, having separate Kubernetes running active, but the dynamic token generations, right? How will that? I mean, that will have an impact, right, to the clients, because the tokens that are generated in one region will not work for the other region, right? So how would you solve?
Right. Right. So there are some. So are you referring to like the OAuth 2 plugin? Here? Yeah. So like OAuth 2 plugin is a very special case where you can run into these issues. The way to solve this is that you could use something like Redis, and like Chris mentions Redis Enterprise in the chat, where you can have active configurations of that to make sure that, you know, clients hitting any region can, you know, be authenticated. I don't think we have tested that, so it will certainly require some more effort. OAuth, like one of the plugins that is very hard to work around with active across regions is OAuth 2. Other plugins are relatively pretty straightforward, but OAuth 2 is really complicated, and the replacement for that is OIDC, which I mean, it doesn't work for everyone because it is an enterprise paid feature. So that helps you, you know, do active much more easy.
Sure. Thank you.
Another question specifically, not specifically with regarding this, Postgres, right? I do understand that right now we support like maybe a user basic authorization with respect to Postgres, but is there any in your roadmap? Do you have anything where you support the certificate-based authentication with respect to Postgres as well?
So are you referring to authentication and authorization between Kong and Postgres, or
Yes.
Kong and the downstream client?
No, Kong and Postgres.
Kong and Postgres. So as far as I know, we do have SSL. We do have
there is one way kind of SSL, not like a two-way SSL, if I'm not wrong.
That probably is correct. I mean, I'm not sure what's the latest update on that specific feature in Kong. What I would recommend, and this is something that we have, at least I have certainly heard of before this ask. So what I would recommend is please go check out 2.4, our latest release, see if it has that feature. If it does not, then please open a GitHub issue to track this. And it is something that is supported by the underlying Postgres library and the TLS implementation we have, but it's a matter of exposing that detail to our end users.
Okay, yeah, I do see that PG Moon has that, but I did not see that here.
Yeah, so I mean, please, if you can, please open a Git tracking issue for that so we can gauge interest and prioritize it.
Sure, thank you.
Since we mentioned the TLS configuration, I have one short question. Do you have any specific TLS route or TLS ingress, I mean, on the plate?
So go ahead, Shane, if you want to take that up.
No, go ahead. I actually kind of missed the question. Sorry.
Okay, so I think, let me rephrase it. I could be understanding Jimin wrong, but the question is, do we, like, since we're talking about TLS, is there like a TLS route or something based on TLS that you could do routing that is on our roadmap? Is that right, Jimin?
Yeah, very similar. So basically it's just, do we already have any TLS route implemented or TLS ingress, something like that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we currently support, HTTP, we support TCP, we support UDP, right? But routing based on something like SNI in TLS, or, like essentially TLS byte streams, is something that Kong supports, but the Ingress controller does not support that yet. We are working on, as Shane pointed out, right, like implementing Gateway API after we release 2.0, and Gateway API has a specification for TLS route, which is what we plan to follow. Yeah. And so that's how we're going to get to that.
Makes sense. Thanks.
So glad you're here, Harry.
Of course. And anybody, if anybody has questions, anything other than Kong and Ingress Controller, Kong, we have Kuma, we have Insomnia, like we have a bunch of products under Kong Inc. now. So any other questions, more than happy to welcome.
This is Banu again. As I said, right, like we are just exploring Kong, just completed a couple of POCs and trying to see if we can enable it. Do you have any best practices guide or something that from the Kong Ingress Controller standpoint that we can, take a look at from the production standpoint, that you can share any reference links or something?
Yeah, so I can try to share some docs on production usages. We do have some production guidelines for Kong itself, and Kong Ingress Controller really builds on top of Kong, right? So I can share you some production usage guidelines.
Sure.
They're going to be a bit rough, and we definitely are lacking documentation in this regard, right? So that's again something that we would like to fix in future, but for now, I'll post a link to that in chat.
Definitely.
Kind of to piggyback on that, and I think I put it in the slides, but I'd since brought it down. We have on Kubernetes Slack, if you're not familiar, just go to Kubernetes community, you'll find their Slack channel. We have a Kong channel there. Always welcome to jump in there. We're active in there. I'm in there all day. If you have like little questions and stuff like that, especially pertaining to things like that, do feel free to hit us up in there.
Okay, thanks, Shane. Yeah.
Yeah, and if anybody else in here that like had a question but they just didn't want to ask it or something like that, like thinks of it later and is like, I should have asked that. Again, another good place to put it right there in Kong on Kubernetes Slack.
One basic question. So does Kong Ingress Controller talks to Postgres, or the Kong proxy container talks to Postgres?
I'm not sure I understood that question necessarily. Could
So
you repeat that?
We have two
Sorry.
containers running on a pod, right? Kubernetes pod, right? Kong Ingress Controller container and Kong proxy container, right?
Yes.
So which talks to Postgres to push the configurations?
The proxy talks to Postgres. If you set it up with Postgres. Kong specifically talks to the KIC, Kubernetes Ingress Controller, specifically talks to the Kong admin API. That's the only thing it interfaces with. So all the interactions with Postgres will actually be the result of hitting that API from the proxy to the Postgres, not from KIC. Does that make sense? Was that a good answer?
So then what are we talking about, like the connection between Kong Ingress Controller and Cassandra, Postgres and all, right? So what is that connection then?
So right now we have in current Kubernetes Ingress Controller and Kong, I'll call it the upstream because it's upstream to us that work on the Kubernetes side of things. There's some, you have to have some awareness of the underlying storage behind the Kong admin API to make decisions about like how you use the API. So when we talk about like the different databases and stuff like that, from the KIC perspective, that's what we're talking about. And then there's an operational side that has nothing to do with the KIC, but rather, so from the KIC side, there's a few things we need to know when making like logical decisions in the KIC. From the operator side, you have to know like operationally how your KIC is set, or how your proxy is set up, what database it's using. Because if it's using DB-less mode, then it's volatile, and you're actually using the Kubernetes API as the source of truth. If you're using Postgres mode, it's persistent, and that is technically one of the sources of truth for your configurations, and that has to be maintained specifically by an operator, or what have you, a Kubernetes operator even. But that is kind of the distinction. It's mostly an operator thing, and then if you're a contributor to the KIC, you'll have to know some of those differences. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Shane. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? I've run out of coffee. I'm terrible. I've got just enough in my system left for more questions, though. So please do feel free. We got a couple more minutes. I see some chat I didn't catch up on yet. Oh, no.
It's
nothing.
Chris asking me if I have gray hair, and the answer is yes. Hey, Chris, good to see you.
I still win with the gray hair, though.
Yeah, I'm just following right behind you in your footsteps,
Great. Hey, this looks great, guys. I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I'm glad to hear it. Glad to get that feedback. Thanks. I was just going to say, you can get rid of the gray hair problem.
So is this a monthly meetup which happens locally, or like is it all over US, or just trying to understand the cadence of this?
It is a monthly meetup, always at the same time. So our next one will be on July 13th. It's the second Tuesday of every month. And we do go over different topics, but be sure to check out, we have an online meetup page. I'm adding it to the chat right now. And you can see there our past and upcoming meetups.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, and just to add to that, right, like our audience has been very varied in the past. So like Kong has adoption globally. So sometimes we get a lot of users from, Asia Pacific region, sometimes in Europe, sometimes in US. But this is what the time that works for most people, not everybody. But if we do have like, a significant audience in any of these regions, we are happy to cater to other time zones better.
Yeah, just let us know.
Sure, I think this works. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, final call for questions. Otherwise, we'll close today's session. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, final reminder to ask any of questions that might come up on that Kong channel on Kubernetes Slack. The link that I just shared will also feature the recording tomorrow. So please check out that link if you'd like to get a copy of this recording. Thanks so much for joining us. Our next call, as I said, will be on second Tuesday of July, which is July 13th. Thank you so much to Shane, especially, and to Harry. And we hope to see you all at our next call. Have a great day, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.